One trick that I doubt many Flutterflow users employ, but one that is super useful, is running Supabase locally on your machine. You do this using a tool called Docker. There's a page in the Supabase documentation about self-hosting with Docker, and after you've installed Docker and followed a few of the instructions on this page, what you can do is you can just go for Docker Compose Up, and it will actually set up Docker as a local image inside of your local computer. This means I can go to a browser and hit localhost 8000, and it will take me to this dashboard that's running on my local machine. So here I've also run some of these SQL commands from earlier in the video, and I've added a table called items. It's a really simple table with just user ID and name and a few RLS policies. So you can play around, add things, mess with RLS policies, and you're not going to be affecting your production or even your development version of your Supabase tables. Now, as well as the starter template that I have for Flutterflow, I've also collected a whole bunch of files for an API. And I'm going to open this folder up with VS Code. This is what an API looks like. It's just a whole bunch of files. Inside of this app directory, we have the API itself, and it starts with this file called main.py. This is written in Python, so the first thing I need to do is open up a terminal, and I'm going to run Poetry. Poetry is a package management system for Python, so I just need to install the dependencies. And these dependencies are defined here in the pyproject.toml file. So I've given it a name already of Palmas, and then I just have things like FastAPI, which is the web framework that I'm going to be using. Firebase admin, super important. I also have PyTest, that's for unit testing, and a bunch of other libraries. Jinja is for templating. And PyFlutterflow is actually mine. It's just a collection of functions and stuff that's useful for Supabase and for Firebase. And it also has an admin dashboard baked in that I've written in the front-end framework Vue.js. I've also pre-filled out a few details about this particular API. So I've given it the title of Palmas, given it a description. And as I showed you before, the Supabase is running locally on my machine. So it's running locally here on localhost at port 8000. And these keys you actually get from the Docker file themselves on your local machine, as described in the Supabase documentation. Later, I'm going to be filling out things like email. I use the service Resend for sending emails, and Cloudinary for image upload. That's optional. All of these are going to be optional, and I'm not going to be using them for the MVP, but I will extend out to use them later on post MVP. Now, all of the setup and configuration is kind of here in this API already, but there's no business logic or anything like that. So I have services in a directory, but there's nothing here yet. This is just where the business logic is going to go. I also have routers. These are also known as views. So for example, for things that users themselves, as opposed to admins, can invoke, I create routes. So I'll have the API running at a particular URL. And if you go /sample, you'll enter into this route if that HTTP verb is get. There's also post, patch, and delete. Now, I also just need to select a Python interpreter after I've run Poetry install. So now Visual Studio Code is of course able to run code, and I have some preset configurations in this launch.json file. I'm going to tell UVcorn, which is what launches the API, to do so on port 8080. I also have another configuration for testing, which I'll go through in a second, but right now I'll go to the debug panel and I'll go for FastAPI to run the API locally. And so actually I can just visit my browser at localhost 8080, and if I go to /docs, FastAPI will give me the routes that I have in this nice web interface. I've already set up certain routes in this boilerplate already with this starter kit, but a lot of what will happen in this API is stuff that I'm going to write in the future, and I'll be replacing the sample user routes and maybe some of the admin routes to start creating custom things, custom business logic, custom functions. In FastAPI, it's also possible to run the test suite. So for that, I also have this set up. I can just go to PyTest, which is the testing framework, and run that. And the nice thing here is that what it's actually doing is it's connecting to the local Supabase database that I set up a moment ago. That's the one that's set up on port 8000. And what the tests are doing is they're actually diving into the database each time, and they're setting up certain sessions. So what I've done here is for test CRUD. And the point of this mostly is just to test the RLS policies. So if a user creates an item, for example, I have this items table with just a name field, just as a test. I want to know that a user can create an item, delete an item, update an item, but that another user cannot do those things to the item that belongs to the first user. This is very basic, but it's very important as well. And it's a really good idea to test these things and to have them tested in an automated fashion. Then when I have this foundation, I can start building other things adding business logic and testing that as well, because this is just going into the roots in the API and performing this business logic. It's going into these views that are defined here in the roots folder. But some of these things, they don't even need a root directly. They can just go and talk to Supabase, and that will ensure that your RLS is working properly. That's the cool thing about Supabase. A lot of this is taken care of for you when it comes to basic logic. And one other thing, I also have an admin dashboard that I've spent time setting up. And what I need for an external application that works independently of Flutterflow, I'm going to need the credentials from the web application in Firebase. So let's grab that. For this, I'm going to head to project settings and I'm going to go down to the Palmas web, which is something that Flutterflow did create. And I need this thing here, the Firebase configuration. Now I know it says API key here, but this is actually a lot like the Supabase anon key. It's actually public. It's no big deal if people see this, but it is used to identify your apps. So this is if, for example, a user wants to sign in, it needs to know which authentication database to sign in to, and that's what this is for. So I just need to change this format from JavaScript over to JSON, which is going to use these double quotes and the space and the colon, and I'll remove the semicolon and then another colon. And now this is going to be valid JSON. This being the case, I can now run the Fast API application again, and I should be able to access the admin dashboard that I've created. And so now instead of docs.fastAPI gives me, I'm going to go to dashboard, and there's my admin dashboard. Now I am going to have to set this up as an authorized domain in Firebase, so we might as well wait until we've deployed it, which is the next step. Okay, so now I'm going to deploy the API, and I'm going to do this with Google Cloud Run. Google Cloud Run is very similar, and in fact they are merging it with Google Cloud Run Functions, which is where all of our Firebase functions are deployed anyway, so it's all going to be nice in the same project in our GCP. For this, I need a command line tool called gcloud. It's easy to download. You just go to the Google page and do the download. I've already run gcloud auth login, but this will open a browser and it will authenticate your local machine with your Firebase project. And then I just need to fill out these variables. Project ID, that's what I get from Firebase. I choose the region, that'll be Europe West for me. And then the service name, I can just name that whatever. I'll go for Palmas API. And then the end file. Now the end file, we already had an end file here, which is for local development, but I also need an end file for production and for the cloud. And this one has to be a .yaml file because that's just the only format that GCP will accept. But you're gonna have different settings in here anyway. For example, I have my Supabase production URL, anon key, JWT secret, and that sort of thing. So now that I have all of this set up, all I actually have to do is just copy paste this whole thing. And in the end, it's going to deploy the API using gcloud run deploy and use these environment variable names. And it's going to do so on behalf of a particular service account in GCP called the compute@developer.gservice. If you go into your own dashboard, you'll generally find that Flutterflow will have created this for you already. So there it is. I can just copy paste this whole thing and shove it into my terminal. Let's go. Okay, so that's been deployed, and now we have a URL that we can visit in the cloud. And if I open my Google Cloud Console and go to Cloud Run Functions, I can actually see the Palmas API running here. Now, there really is unlimited potential in having an API like this. You can make it do whatever you want to do. For one thing, I have my dashboard. So actually what I'm going to do is I'm going to go into the Firebase authentication page and add this dashboard to the authorized URLs. I can actually also use this to run web pages, but to do that, this URL is a little bit ugly. So I'm gonna use something called custom domains in Firebase. Your first time doing this, you'll have to actually set up a domain, but I've already set one up at keely.studio. So I've verified that domain already with my domain registrar. And then all I have to do is say, I'll call this as a subdomain. It'll be palmas.keely.studio, and I'll continue that. Now I just need to copy this into my domain registrar, which happens to be Cloudflare. And once I've done that, I'll just have to wait a little bit, and there should be a palmas.keely.studio URL that I can use. And you can do this for any domain that you own. Okay, so now that I've added this CNAME to my Cloudflare account, I can go back to Firebase, and as well as the Cloud Run URL, I'm also going to add this custom URL of palmas.keely.studio. So in the meantime, I can go back to the admin dashboard, and now it should be possible to log in. Now, the security on my admin panel is actually quite strict. So Even though I can use the admin panel to add new admins, I need to create the first admin, and I can only do that programmatically. So I'm going to use this script here called create admin, which is included with my API. And there's also going to be an option as opposed to fast API and PyTest to run the current file. So I'm going to run this script, and then it's going to prompt me for the ID of the user that I want to make into an admin. Perfect. Now I can head back to my admin panel, and I should be able to log in with Google. Now, this whole admin panel, I've got, say, the notifications, I've got my users, I've also got my Firebase users. I've also got terms and conditions. And so actually one thing that I can do is I can edit this. This is the new terms and conditions. And I have another page that exists within the API as well itself. And it's going to be web pages privacy policy. That's the privacy policy page. And then I've got terms and conditions, which I've just changed. So this is the new terms and conditions. And so you can put all of your terms and conditions in here, and you can update them in this way. This is really powerful because it actually becomes a full content management system. I have users and notifications, but I can actually add new fields into the configuration file in the API, and I can do CRUD operations on any tables that I want. This means that anyone on your team can start messing around with data if they're authorized to do so if they're an admin. And I can also go into users and I can actually make new admins. Okay, we are 3 hours in, it's 12:33, almost time for lunch. I do usually prefer to eat organic. It's just healthier in many ways. Okay, now it's time to set up Supabase. So we've already got the app compliance. Here's the new terms and conditions that I just set up in the dashboard. We've got notifications, which we'll go into in a little bit, and we've got our users table. And remember, we're not using Supabase auth. We're still using Firebase auth and using the cloud function and the custom code that I showed you earlier to be able to unite the two. Now I can get into the actual tables in my application. I'm going to set up one called posts, and I'll just speed through this and then talk about what is going on in a second. Okay, so these posts are what are going to appear in the feed, and they're just going to be bits of text with an image, maybe some content. So I've got title, I've got content, I've got the image URL, I've got some tags as well. And the tags are going to be sort of fundamental to this application, in that they're an array of strings where people can subscribe and unsubscribe to whatever tags they're interested in. Traditional wisdom would actually say that I also need a join table between the tags table, which I'm going to create in a second, and the posts table. But actually, Postgres has got so powerful now, there are other ways to do this. And what I'm actually going to do to avoid having to have another table is I'm just going to make tags into an array. So I've actually defined tags as an array, and I've given it a default value of being empty. And then I'm going to write some interesting logic in the Supabase URL that I'm going to use in Flutterflow to be able to find the right tags and filter them correctly as they relate to posts. And then I've got my user ID, and the user ID is going to foreign key to the users table. And this is how I can identify users when they're creating posts and how they can manage their own posts. So I'll save this table, and then I'm going to set up the RLS policy. For posts, I'm going to set up 3 RLS policies. The first one is for the users that create a post in general. I'm just going to go for all. Sometimes it's better to fine-grain these things into select, insert, update, and delete. But for this one, I'm actually just going to go admin and authenticated are the roles of interest. This policy name is going to be users can manage their own data. They can manage their own posts, that's better. And then I'm going to set these auth policies. Now, what's happening here is that the JWT token that I am minting using the cloud function that I deployed has inside of it a sub field, and that's the Firebase ID. And that's going to match the user ID because I've set up the users table to have IDs that match the Firebase auth ID. So I can just mint a token using the Firebase auth, have Supabase auth accept that, and then pass it into the RLS policy here. So what this means is that if I've created a post, then I will have rights to delete or update that post. And so that's fine, and we'll save that. Next, I want anybody to actually be able to see the post. Even though they can't update or delete the posts, anybody should be able to see the posts in their feed if they're subscribed with the right tags. So I'm going to use authenticated and admin. And in this case, it's just going to be true because it's not insert, update, delete. It's not all, it's just select. So that means that any user can see any post. finally, what I'm going to do is I'm going to give administrators the right to do anything. So I'll just call it admins can do anything. And I'm going to give this to admin, and then it's going to be Alt-JWT. This time it's role. Now, this has been created by the cloud function again that I set up. So when I set up the way in which that you could mint Supabase tokens, I also added in a role flag. This is known as role-based access control, or RBAC. And what it's doing is it's decoding the token, and then it's grabbing the role. It's saying, hey, is that role going to be the string admin? If so, you can do anything. This RLS policy applies to you. The second table I'm going to create is called tags. And the tags table is actually very simple. It really just has a name and nothing else. No foreign keys, anything like that. Now for tags, nobody can create a tag except for the admins. So I'm going to create an RLS policy whereby admins can do anything again. And it's just going to be admin. And I'm going to add this Alt-JWT role admin rule again. But that's actually not much good unless users can actually see the tags. So I'll set select, I'll go for admin and also authenticated. So anybody, both admins and authenticated users can see it, and then users can see tags. And that's just going to be true. And make sure it's set to select. And that's it, that's Supabase set up. Back to Flutterflow. At this point, we've deployed a skeleton of the app and notifications should theoretically be working. So it's a good idea now to download the app into TestFlight and see if there are any issues. Since there's basically nothing in the app, this really narrows the scope of possible causes to any issues we might have. Now my build succeeded, but it hasn't been passed through to TestFlight because of this missing compliance check. And it's really annoying to have to do this every time. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to add a permission here in the Flutterflow permissions tab. And this permission is going to be ITS app uses non-exempt encryption, and also Android permission ITS app uses non-exempt encryption, and set that to false. And if you do this, it will pass the TestFlight checks for the encryption and you won't have to release the app each time in TestFlight. Okay, so in TestFlight, I can go ahead and open the application and I get the starter screen. And I'm gonna go ahead and get started with a new account. Now, it's really important when this thing gets set up, I need to check my Firebase as well and make sure that the device tokens from this device are getting saved in Firestore. So now that I'm logged in, I'm gonna refresh my Firestore and I'll have a look for the new user record that I just created. That is this one. And yeah, here we go. I got my FCM token. Perfect. So that's a good sign. So I'll send it and see if it comes through. Yep, there it is. Okay, finally. Now I'm gonna move on to the UI builder part. Now, I am going to speed up the video throughout this building the UI part, and that's because this video isn't really about building a UI, it's about the end-to-end process of getting an app from zero into the App Store with Flutterflow. Okay, I've put something together and now I'm ready for a deploy. But first, as promised, I'm going to take you through some of the structure of this page. Basically, it's an infinite scrolling page. And the first thing I had to think about was, how do you do infinite scroll with Supabase? It turns out it's relatively easy to do, but Flutterflow don't set this up for you, so you need to do it yourself. The idea here is that I've done it all essentially in this one query, get feed. And the tricky part here is in the query parameters. There's quite a lot of them because I have to think about tags as well as the order as well as the pagination. So what I've done here is I've set an offset. You can do this in Supabase when it comes to PostGREST. There are different ways to call Supabase, and one is by the URL. And if you do it this way, you can add offset into the URL parameters itself. If you combine this with a limit, actually we should probably increase this limit to maybe 5, probably something bigger actually later on, but 5 is fine for now. That will create the infinite scroll effect. Another thing that I'm doing is I'm doing a join with the users table. So because users and the posts table, because they're joined already by way of foreign key, I can just use this syntax and I can get everything from posts and everything from users in the same query. And then finally, I use this OV keyword for filtering by the tags. And that way only the tags that I want to appear in my feed will appear, and I'm setting that from the navigation drawer. The other API call that I created towards the end there was to go for push notifications, because in my API, which I deployed and we sent to palmas.keeley.studio, I have an endpoint in Fast API that allows me to send notifications, and it also creates a record in the notifications table. With a standard API call, I also need the Firebase auth token because my API knows how to decode the Firebase auth token, and so I trigger that whenever a post is created. I would want to tweak the logic later so that only people who are subscribed to certain tags will get certain notifications, but I'll do that post MVP. And so the way that I create this feed, I mean, we're starting off with the app bar, and I already have the gear icon and the notifications bell for the notifications page. I just added a plus button here, and that will open a bottom sheet. And the bottom sheet is for creating new posts. I also have this drawer here, and if I go to edit the drawer, I can select which tags I want to see in the post. And when I select those tags, the feed will update itself. Then, as I said, I'm doing some join tables with the users, and so I can get the user's avatar and their name here. I can also set this conditionally rendered delete button, so if this is your post, you can delete it, but nobody else will be able to delete your posts. Then I've got the title of the post and the content. And the content is sitting inside of an expandable. And the reason for this is so that when you're scrolling, you don't have to see the entire post, but if you tap on the content, then you will be able to see all of what's in there. Then of course, there's the image attached to the post, and then there's a relative timestamp, so it might show something like a moment ago or a week ago or whenever the post was made. The way that I've set up the infinite scroll is here. So I go to get feed, turn on infinite scroll, and the offset then gets set by the pagination, the number of loaded items, which is something that comes from enabling the infinite scroll. And then the Supabase JWT is actually from the app state. So I did have to set up some app state variables as well to enable this. I set up some tags app state things so that I could manage the tags so that when you select a tag that it stays persistently. But I also needed to set the Supabase auth token into the app state. And that's something that my custom function update Supabase token does under the hood. So down here at the bottom, we've got FF app state, and it updates the Supabase auth token app state using the Supabase token, which is created from minting the token using my cloud function. And then of course there's the plus button. So if you want to create a new post, I created a bottom sheet here. You can add the title, you can create the post, upload the image, and give it certain tags. Now the tags will be controlled by the admin, and we're going to be able to do that via the admin dashboard, which I will show you after we've deployed the app. And actually there is one more thing to do. I do need to set up these legal pages. So I'm going to need to go into the account page. I think it was in profile. No, it's in the account page and terms of use. And I've actually set up a couple of parameters here. So when the user taps, the value will become the privacy policy. Sorry, that's privacy policy. I need terms of service. And then again, this one is the actual privacy policy. Good stuff. So I'm going to do a mobile deploy here, and then we'll give it a proper test. We can call this, actually, let's go for version 0.1.0 in this case. So now version 0.1 of the app is building, and in the meantime, I just want to talk a bit more about the dashboard and some of the things that I've set up with the starter kit that will need to happen when you're going to be deploying an app to the App Store. Remember, we set up a custom domain and it was at palmas.keeley.studio, and if I go to /dashboard, now that this has been set up, I get this. And another thing that I've actually done is I've added the tags to the JSON file that sets up the various things that you can see in the dashboard. So if I go to tags now, I've got a couple of sample tags, and I can add them or I can change their names or that kind of thing. So any admin can now set up new tags for the application. Another thing that I've done is I've gone and grabbed some boilerplate terms and conditions and a boilerplate privacy policy for this app. And to be honest, since it's an MVP, I'm not worrying too much about this. I will want to go through this again a bit later. But for now, I've just swapped out the names and added Palmas to the terms and conditions and privacy policy that I already had. And because of this admin dashboard, I can just make changes and save these, and they will be updated and reflected in the application itself. And that happens because I used a web view in the app. So this is actually just a web page, palmas.keely.studio, and web pages terms and conditions. This is something I've set up in the API. So I only had to deploy one thing and then just add these pages using a templating language in Python. So now these will appear in the app when you go to the terms and conditions and privacy policy pages. And there are also links that I can use. There's a reason why I set this up instead of just using the standard Google Cloud Run domain, because that one's very messy and the App Store might not accept it. Of course, it's going to look even better if it's something like palmas.com, but it's going to be whatever domain you happen to own. There are two other important things that you're going to need. One is the support URL. And so I've also got a template for the support, and it's basically just, it can be as simple as an email address and a link to the privacy policy and terms of service. The App Store just needs to know that something is there and that there's a support email. And the last one is data removal. In most countries, I think you're going to have the obligation to remove data if a user asks for this. And this is actually as simple as a contact form. So I just needed to hook up the email. So it's just a case of hooking up an email address or adding this to the database and giving that option to remove the data if it's asked. Also, while we're waiting for that build, we want to create some screenshots. And luckily, Flutterflow provides this. So I can go for screenshot mode. What I can do is I can actually just set the text. So this will be me. So I'm just going to go through all of these and add some sort of dummy data to the relevant pages. Now, before I do another build, I do want to just mention permissions super quickly because the camera, notifications, and photo library are in use. And the App Store actually obliges you to give a bit more information as to why you want to be using the camera and the notifications and the photo library. So I just need to say something like, this app would like to access your camera, so you may upload images if you choose to make a post, and similar for notifications and photo library. This is called a permission string, and it's necessary to customize it before sending to the App Store. Okay, I'm gonna go for it with another build now. So I've just downloaded the most recent build, and actually let's start by triggering a push notification. So it should come right in as I trigger it from the back end. Here we go. Nice, so now I can tap on the notification and get into the home page. At first, I can start messing around with the tags and that sort of thing and removing the different posts that I don't want to see. So let's say I don't want to see events. I'll just see things like hiking, and I'll turn on events and I'll have a lot more things to play with. So this is the infinite scrolling list, and it's going to go through all of the posts. And I can also tap on the body of these posts and I can see the entire thing. I can also tap on the body again to minimize it. And if I want, I can create my own post. This is a test post. Hello. I can upload an image if I want to, and I'll give it the tag of events. And that's actually also going to trigger a notification. I don't have in-app notifications on at the moment, so it doesn't appear here, but it will appear in other people's phones if they have the app installed. And there's my post, and also I can say, oh hey, this is my own post, so I've got this delete button here, and so I can remove a post as well. And I've got the account page. In this case, the terms and conditions is actually set up now, so I can open up the terms and conditions, and it renders from the web page, which is nice. And then I have my notifications. So I've sent two, I've actually received my own notification, so I don't need that one, so I can remove it. Or if I want to, I can actually just mark all of them as red, or I can clear all of the notifications. That's it. The app is super simple, and that's fine. I'm hoping it can get through the App Store review. It is possible that it's too simple an MVP, but I think that the way it's set up, it has a decent chance of passing. If not, I'll just see what the reviewers say and see how I might be able to tweak the application. Okay, home stretch at this point. I'm going to speed up the video again. I'm going to fill out the form fields in the App Store, and then before I click submit, I will just show you some of the things that I've done. Okay, cool. That should be everything. Now, there may be one or two fields when I click add for review that I will see I've forgotten, but overall, I think I've gotten everything. Now, of course, first there's the preview and screenshots, and we have these. We generated them from Flutterflow. Promotional text is not necessary, but these are things that you can tweak along the way with new builds. The description, I'll be honest, I used ChatGPT, as with the keywords. Now, the support URL is something that we created earlier. Remember, we created this palmas.keely.studio domain. This is just pointing to the Google Cloud Run instance, and that is pointing to my API, my Python API. and the web pages are coming out of that. I also need the copyright field. This one is mine, so I'll just take 2025. John Keeley should do. The version, I generally just use the bundle version, and then I add the build. This is the latest build, version 0.1.1. And then the Apple tester, they're going to want to be able to sign in. So I've also created an account. I just use my keeley.studio domain, and I have this one set up already in my Cloudflare. And then I just give the Apple tester a password that they can log in with. I'm going to manually release this version as well, so I can click a button rather than having it auto deploy. I just need to save that as well. So there's a few things you kind of just need to go through, things like the category, the age rating, some of these things that you'll need, some of these things you won't need. It just takes a bit of practice getting through the App Store. Then you need privacy. This is super important, the privacy policy URL. And as I showed before, it's all just coming from the API in the web pages that I've created with the starter kit. Then you need to start talking about the data privacy, the product page review. So what data you're linking, it's going to be things like name, email address. If you're collecting phone or physical address info, you are obliged to put it in here. Because we're using Firebase, there is a third-party element here, but it's not going to be directly linked to tracking in my case. Again, it just takes a little bit of practice figuring out some of these fields, but overall they're not complicated. And actually, arguably, Google is more complicated when it comes to the data security and data privacy section in the Play Store. I'm also using things like device ID, and that's the device ID in the form of FCM tokens that we're collecting in Firestore. And again, there's some Firebase things here. We've got crash data, and that's coming from Crashlytics, so we need to declare that. And of course, the user ID. And then there's just a few other fields that you kind of go through, and you can just literally check boxes and that sort of thing. You also need to set things like pricing. There's a few fields here that you can skip though, in-app events and product page optimization. You can do this stuff later. It's not necessary for the first submission to the App Store. And that's a lot. It's time to go for it. Add for review. Let's see what happens. All right, the day's done, and I'm going to submit my app, Palmas, for review. And so that's everything. I have now submitted an app to the Apple App Store. Now, the app may or may not pass the app review. That wasn't really the point that I was trying to make with this video. What I'm trying to get across is that the full structure of an application, end to end, the fundamental functionality that an app needs, it can be deployed to the App Store, in theory, in one day. After this, if something fundamental breaks, at least you know that when you started, it was working, making debugging 100 times easier. If you're 6 months into an app and you have never had notifications working, that's kind of on you. You could have and should have been debugging in the first week when the app was still minimal. I'm not saying you have to hit the review button before you're ready. What I'm saying is that get the app into TestFlight. Have a think about compliance, web pages, notifications, auth, everything else that your app needs. Maybe even do a web deploy and share it with some early alpha testers. So, what's your opinion? How close are you to the App Store? Leave a comment down below. I'd love to hear your opinions. Incidentally, I did race through that part about the admin panel, but I think it's a really useful feature to include in an app. So check out this video as well to learn how to build your own. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.